I stumbled on a poaching dump when I was 14. I used to hike trails near our home, way out in the woods. I'd explore and then have to find my way back without a compass. I went far one day, probably 2 to 3 miles through these old logging trails. I started smelling something terrible. There was a rocky outcrop right before a cliff. At the bottom of the cliff, there was a massive pile of dead deer. Most were decapitated. Some were fawns. Had to have been 20 to 30 of them at varying states of decay. The stench was mind-altering bad. When I thought I had seen enough, I heard four-wheelers and decided to hide. 2 poachers in camo rolled up and tossed 2 more deer carcasses on the pile. They smoked, talked, and then left after about 10 minutes. I was probably 15 feet from them the entire time, hiding under a hemlock tree. I did not recognize either of them, and I knew everyone on that entire side of town. It was only 15 to 20 houses in a 5-mile stretch. I ran home and told my parents. They didn't believe me. Plus, they didn't know I was running off to those trails, so I got in huge trouble for that. I mentioned it to our neighbor who was big into hunting. He seemed very concerned and brought it up to the game warden. They investigated it and found the dump site, but never caught anybody. I am 100% certain it was not my neighbor. Number 2. This time last year I was on a night hike with a UV light looking for scorpions and was stalked by a mountain lion. There were 3 of us and a little dog. While in the caboose position, I took a glance behind me and saw something jump off the trail and into the scrub/cacti. It was tough to convince everyone else, but finally, the middle person saw my headlamp illuminate its back and tail. Now everyone is confident that we're being stalked. We keep close and I'm walking backward in the rear as we approach a trailhead parking lot area. The person in front taps the only occupied car's window, busts up a blowy, and requests that the driver reposition and turn on his headlights. He complies, and then we all saw a full-grown panther about 20 foot off to the side of the trail. It knew it was spotted and ran. I'm pretty sure it was going for the little dog, but it's concerning that it stalked us for like 0.25 miles in the middle of the night. Been doing fewer scorpion hunts since then, but still get out plenty. Things are just a little more tense and observant now. Number 3. Hiking in Alaska, I once found myself 50 yards from a grizzly bear and her cub. But weirdly, I wasn't worried as we were at a creekside that was having a heavy salmon run and she was way more interested in the fish than me. I just took some pictures and then backed away slowly. What did scare the shit out of me was the time I was hiking near Homer, Alaska on what felt like an almost suburban bike path. A moose and her calf walked out of the woods in front of me. Moose are so huge. They are not like deer at all. I was inside of my car, but she was between me and it. I was hoping she would continue walking, but she decided to stop and eat some of the tall shrubbery along the edge of the path, all the while staring at me. It felt like hours that I stood there frozen until she eventually moved on, but in reality, it was probably only a few minutes. Number 4. Back in 2015, I was on a hiking trail in Arizona. I have hiked a lot in worse terrains in Europe, so I wasn't too worried about doing it alone. It was almost getting dark and I was at an eerily deserted stretch for what felt like hours now. Suddenly I heard a kind of music. As I kept going, I realized it was someone whistling. It gave me the creeps, but the idea of company relieved me a bit too. Soon enough, I saw a man in front of me walking in the same direction. He was wearing a t-shirt and pants which was surprisingly inadequate, especially for the impending night. I passed him by. He was the one whistling indeed, turned to say the customary greetings. He looked up, deadpan, and without a word turned back down towards the ground and kept whistling. He was walking slowly in an almost trance-like manner. I quickly averted my gaze forward and almost abruptly the whistling stopped. I turned back to see what happened and there was no one on the trail. Zilch. Did not even feel like anyone had been there. Needless to say, I freaked the hell out. I made it back without any further issues, but I still think about what I saw/heard that night. Number 5. Late 90s, I was in my junior year of high school and hiking up Usuri Mountain in East Mesa, Arizona with my best bud and two girls we liked. We reached the wind cave at the top but wanted to keep going, so we scrambled up to the summit to take in the view. My friend was sitting on a rock and noticed an old rusty Altoids tin box and picked it up. Inside were two folded up pieces of white paper which he spread out on the rock. The first page was a crude sketch of the view from that exact spot, drawn in pencil with the caption "The last view from," name as eyes with the date. I believe it was only some months or a year past. The second page was an apology letter listing people in this person's life and things they were sorry to have said or done to them. We surmised that it was a suicide note and started searching the backside of Usuri for anything. Something. Remains, clothes, more clues. Nothing. This was the late 90s and internet search was not a thing yet, so we went to the Central Mesa Library to sort through the microfiche files, skimming through newspapers a little after the date on the drawing for any lost person notices or any news related, and again nothing, but it was fun feeling like I was Encyclopedia Brown for an afternoon. Some years later, my friend moved to another part of the US and hasn't really kept in touch, but I often wonder if he still has the tin and if he ever found the person's identity using modern research methods. Unsatisfying end to the story, I know, but it was a little creepy and a little sad. Plus, I got to use the word microfiche. East Mesa has a surprising amount of culty aspects that I experienced growing up. I should probably write them all down. Number 6. I was hiking in northern Ontario through an old mining road. Years of neglect had fallen on tons of trees. My partner and I had 27 pounds packs on, so ducking or going over fallen trees was time-consuming/tiring. We got to the point on the trail where we needed to go south to the lake. There was a beach there we spotted on Google Earth. Thinking nothing of it, we head straight through the forest, no path. For those that have been through boreal forests, you know what I'm talking about. I'm up front for the first part. I step near a conifer truck. I'm 2 feet away from the trunk, but my foot disappears into a hole. I don't lose my balance and quickly recover, but used a nearby stick to poke around the area. It's just a fake top with broken branches and brown pine needles. Don't know how far it went down. Came to the realization there are a lot of holes in this forest. We kept our distance from any conifer trunk and made it safely to our destination, and it was worth the hike. And we made it safely home. If something bad had happened, we were many miles away from the main road and tough hauling back through the old mining road. Number 7. Not a hiking story, but more woods related. A family was camping and their golden retriever brought a human femur with an artificial hip joint attached to it out of the woods. I was a rural cop who handled the case. We ran the serial number on the hip and it came back to a woman who had been reported missing in the area about 15 years prior. Multiple theories had been put forward, but her body and vehicle had never been recovered. We organized a search party to recover the remains and were able to locate both her remains and the vehicle and solve the case. There was a section of the highway about 2 miles north of the campsite where the dog had found the femur. It made a sharp turn and had about a 50-foot drop into a heavily forested basin. Her vehicle left the road and crashed at the bottom of the cliffs, killing her. Scavenger animals then spread the remains over a wide area in the basin. It is a remote area and nobody would have witnessed the crash, and the car was not visible from the top of the cliffs. So she and her car had been missing for 15 years and was only sitting 50 feet off the road the entire time. Number 8. We had hiked in about 10 miles to go trout fishing, finished for the day, had supper, and the 4 of us were in a tent for the night. At about 3 a.m., one of the guys woke us up. There was a sniffing, something moving around the camp. It finally started sniffing and snuffling and pushing against the tent door. I mean, trying to get in. A nose outline was pushed into the fabric, and they all thought it was a bear. I was tasked with pointing my pistol at the door while one of the other guys unzipped it a little bit and rolled away so we could see what this creature was. It poked its nose through the tent door. Everyone screamed, "Shoot it, shoot it." I was safety off, trigger halfway pulled when I realized it was a coon dog nose poking through the door. It was just lost and spent the rest of the night in the tent with us and was our best dog buddy for the next several days. Number 9. Technically didn't see it, but weird/creepy story. I was hiking Cerro Churripo in Costa Rica last May. 42 km trail that I started at midnight and finished at 5:30 p.m. There's a lodge at the base of the trail. Once I finished and got back, there were cops with a family there. I ate dinner and went to bed, not knowing what was going on. The next day I found out that a woman who was hiking with 2 family members had disappeared on the hike. She had been hiking ahead of the other 2 for a short period when they heard her scream. When they caught up to where she had been, she wasn't there or anywhere to be found. They searched and called out as long as possible until they had to head down the trail to seek help. They found her body 4 days later. She had fallen off a large cliff. Turns out I passed her dead, or dying, body unknowingly at some point on the hike. Number 10. I was hiking alone with my dog. It was at the beginning of the hike, so I was still very close to a town. I met a family walking together, a man, a woman, and a kid. The man says hi to me and it's obvious he wants to talk, so I stop, assuming he wants to ask about my dog's breed or something. My dog smells him and he says to my dog, you know who the master is here, WTF? Then he asks me, are you not afraid to walk alone? I tell him, no, I'm not. Then he asks me, are you sure? You're a young woman alone, are you not afraid of being attacked? Well, now I am, thanks. I tell him that I'm close to the town, so no. He then told me how I shouldn't be without a man and keeps asking, are you not scared of being assaulted or killed by someone? At this point, I wanted to ask him if by someone he meant him. I pointed out that I had a big dog with me and told him how my dog was protective and wouldn't hesitate to defend me if anything goes wrong, which is true, but I mostly said it to scare him in case he had bad intentions. I made eye contact with the woman and kid at some point, and it was obvious they were embarrassed. Eventually, I left and I never saw them again. This all took place in a rural area in France, not a place that's especially dangerous for women. Another scary thing I saw was a fucking massive boar. It took me a minute to understand what that creature was. But that's not as scary as a creepy dude. Number 11. 2 weird encounters on separate occasions, on the same trail. In the mountains of North Georgia, the state, I, male, was hiking with a friend, female, visiting from out of state. We were on mile 4-ish of a 7-mile loop. Walking in the opposite direction of us was a big man who was only wearing overalls and very clearly pitching a tent. He had the longest toenails and had a huge knife strapped to his waist. He smiled at us and said hello. We returned the greeting and kept walking, and then he said that my friend was beautiful. The second we passed him, my friend and I gave each other the look and booked it. I stayed behind her the rest of the time hiking and kept glancing over my shoulder until we got to the car. The second time I was hiking alone with my dog, and maybe mile 6 of the 7-mile loop I run into a group of men. One was wearing a monk's robe and had no hair at all on his head, and the other 2 were wearing all white and were kneeling in front of Baldy humming. The bald guy and I make eye contact and he tells me life is a gift. When he finished that sentence, both of the kneeling men stopped humming and snapped their heads to look at me. I panic and just say heck yeah it is and keep walking. The 2 guys started humming again, but I could feel Baldy's eyes burning a hole in the back of my head as I hiked up the switchback to the car. Needless to say, after those experiences I have not gone back to that trail. Number 12. A buddy of mine and I were hiking Mount Washington in October. We are seasoned and prepared hikers. It was a windy, cold day, but we had a great time and managed to also bag Monroe between sets of clouds just obscuring everything. We knew that we'd be hiking in the dark and planned according. We are hiking down the Jewel Trail with the headlamps on, and out of the darkness we hear hello. My buddy and I both shit ourselves. Standing there is a young woman and her boyfriend in sneakers and light jackets, freezing. No backpacks, no water, no nothing. We start to ask questions and they only speak French. My buddy thankfully is a native speaker, so we get the whole story. They started hiking up Jewel at 3 p.m. From there they managed to fumble around and then they lost the light. This was 2008, so smartphones weren't terrible, but not great. It didn't take long for them to blow the batteries trying to use them as flashlights. Too afraid to go downhill in the dark, they did do the sensible thing and just stopped and stayed on the trail. We gave them water and food and our spare layers and started back down the trail. We got them back to their car and they thanked us profusely. I always wondered how people could die in the lights. This was the first time seeing how unprepared people will gleefully go down the trail without care. Number 13. Not a hiker, but I trail rode horses for 15 years growing up. I'll keep this relatively short and succinct because I'd rather not relive the whole thing. Was in the Rockies with my dad one summer vacation when I was 14 and a family of 4 was hiking ahead of us on the trail. They had a good head start. Kids petted our horses before they left the trailhead as we were saddling up. Came up on 3 of them just before bend. Stopped and chatted and asked where 10-year-old boy was. They said he was around the bend checking something out. Rode ahead a bit around the bend and found a mountain lion in the trail. It was standing above the boy. Blood everywhere. My dad charged his horse at the mountain lion, pulled the revolver he always carried while we were on the trail, and shot in the air. Gutsiest shit I've ever seen. Lion ran pretty fast into the woods. Dad fired 2 of them after he had passed the boy, then turned around and jumped off to see the kid. I came up since my saddlebags had the first aid kit that we carried. The kid was still alive, but my dad had his hand over the kid's throat. Blood everywhere. Father of the family came around the corner to see what the gunshots were about and saw the boy. There was a lot of yelling, but I don't remember what was said. I was locked up on my horse. I was a Boy Scout and had first aid training, but I was just frozen there. I don't remember thinking much of anything, just in shock. I don't want to type out the rest, but the younger boy didn't make it. A mountain lion was hunted down by park rangers days later. Found out that it was pregnant and starving, which is why it likely was inclined to target a human. I tell this story here as a warning to any hikers, bikers, or whoever goes out into the woods, especially in places with a higher population of predatory animals like the Rockies. Stay together, stay armed, gun, mace, both whatever, and stay informed of the dangers. Listen to the rangers and their warnings. Prepare, take precautions, and for goddamn sake, do not go by yourself. Number 14. I've seen all sorts of animals, but what messed me up was a literal child, alone, with a broken arm 15 miles into the woods on a mountain bike. I used to be a mountain bike photographer. I'd hike, sometimes drive, miles up a mountainside and take pictures of the events. Some deadbeat dad, despite the mom's complaints, encouraged his kid to do the ride alone. The dad didn't do the event, he was just there drunk in his RV. The mom wasn't there and didn't know. The kid was laying in the bushes. He was quiet. I asked if he had cell service and he said no. I asked for his mom's number and I ran to the next rest stop a mile ahead. It was awful having to leave the child alone. I stopped doing events shortly after that, mostly because it was too risky. I'd be alone with no cell service, no gun to protect me from bears, and often riders would go missing. I just couldn't mentally do it anymore. Did I mention I did this with no pay? Number 15. I don't tell this story often. I was young, 5 to 6, walking with my brother 14 to 15 in a forest area. I see a backpack, and as I get closer to it, notice a young girl sleeping beside it. I point her out to my older brother, then I notice she didn't quite look right and her dress wasn't covering her. Mostly I remember my brother's grip on my arm pulling me away and the tears in his eyes as we quickly walk out of there and back home. My brother asked me to grab something from his room as he had a hushed conversation with my mom. They phoned somebody, the police came, and my brother left with them. We never went walking in that area again. I blocked it out as a kid, but something triggered the memory a few years ago and I brought it up with my brother one time, thinking it was a dream or I was misremembering. He went white and said he didn't realize I remembered and that he couldn't talk about it. Number 16. I'm not sure if I can call this a hiking story, but I hope this will make sense. While I was still living in the US with my dad, we would often visit my grandma. She lived in the middle of the woods, but there was still some land to walk freely without going into the woods. My dad and I were driving to her house to repair something because she was gone for a few days and couldn't call anyone. My dad needed something, so he wanted to go ask her neighbors to see if they have what he needed. I was doing my own thing till I turned around, seeing my uncle, Grandma's son, looking straight at me from the corner of the house. I shouted out to my dad, "Hey Dad, Uncle's name is over there." He didn't see him, so I told him to follow me, and that's when my uncle just walked away. Every time we turned the corner, I would see him walking off. My dad eventually asked where he was, and I would tell him that he keeps turning the corner over and over. He went around the house one more time and didn't find my uncle anywhere. That's when I got scared and told him I don't feel so well and if we can go back home. Since my dad couldn't do anything because he didn't have the thing that he needed, we just went home. While we were driving away, I looked in the side view mirror and saw my so-called uncle standing by the house. I'm now 18 and still wondering what I saw. Number 17. Back in the early 90s, I did an overnight small chunk of the Appalachian Trail with 2 work friends. It was rainy and miserable. I had a cheap sleeping bag and an ancient external frame backpack that made me worry about being a lightning rod at that elevation. We got lost on the way out and started bitching at each other and settled into grumpy silence. We hadn't seen anyone the whole time, but then we could hear somebody coughing, like a wet croupy hacking cough. Turns out it was a single adult man and a kid. They were wearing rain gear but didn't otherwise seem outfitted for even a short jaunt like us, much less a longer hike. The kid looked miserable, just coughing and coughing, and we passed each other in silence. I was a kid myself, maybe 19, but the older I have gotten, the more I think about this little 5-minute snippet of my life. I have kids now. That child had glassy eyes and a flushed face, a sure sign of fever. Its hair was stuck to its face from the rain. I still remember that sad little resigned look in its eyes as we passed. We were mics and mics from any kind of access point or way station. I never would just keep walking now. The dad, I hope it was their dad, and I would have a frank conversation. Did they need help? Dry socks? A snack? Was he aware that his kid needs to get off the trail ASAP? Etc. I think about it a lot. Number 18. Was hiking along one of the outlier Appalachian trails. I was alone. I always hike with a pistol. I followed a game trail for a spell to climb high in a ridge in hopes to get some pics from a vantage point when I heard a low, guttural growl from a thicket. I'm familiar with most animal sounds from this area. I don't know what it was and have not heard since. I stopped and peered into the thicket but couldn't see anything obvious. I drew my weapon and backed out of the trail for about 100 yards and walked the rest of the trail back to the main hiking trail. I continued until I came across a man and woman hiking with a dog. The dog was fairly aggressive and gave them fits holding him, so we didn't chat. I moved on another 100 yards and stopped for lunch. I wish I had time to inform them I heard something, but figured they wouldn't travel the game trail. As I was eating my lunch, I heard the dog go ballistic in the distance. I quickly grabbed my things and walked back towards the game trail I followed earlier. I never saw those people again. I checked the papers and researched, but no one ever was reported missing from that area. To this day, I never found out what was growling in the thicket. Number 19. Was walking through a not so popular or known trail. It wasn't marked very well. We got turned around a few times and there weren't a lot of signs that people went on this trail often. Most paths were tough to see if they were even trails or we were just wandering. Then we saw what looked like a dense area of trees and what looked like a path. So head towards it, and it was a well-traveled path. Just in this little area, we take a turn and see some strange shiny reflective objects in the tree. Cautiously round the turn, and then as far as we could see, about 30 yards on the only straight path, were Christmas ornaments. I mean, there had to be hundreds of them, really creepy ones and some standard. Some looked personal, but it wasn't the oddity of some of them, it was the sheer amount of them on an unmarked trail in the middle of the woods after we got turned around a bit. That shit was probably the weirdest shit I have ever witnessed. Looked it up on all trails after we made it out, and there were no comments on that trail about Christmas ornaments. Number 20. Not much of a hiker, but while I was a teenager, my friends and I would trek out through the woods or on a trail to smoke weed far away from anyone who would care or have time to bust us for it, and one time we saw a coyote probably 10 meters away from us and we froze for a second, but they're pretty small so we just made big arms at it and it ran off. But then we saw what looked like the same coyote probably 20 minutes later, and we're pretty high at this point, so we were just looking at it and talking. Then one of our friends sitting with his back to us goes, "Oh, look at that," pointing in the other direction, where two more coyotes were watching us, about the same distance away as the first. It took me longer than I cared to admit to pipe up, "I think we're surrounded," and without another word, all 4 or 5 of us stood up and started sprinting in the same direction. It was like when you're a kid and running around a dark building and someone convinced you they saw a ghost and everyone runs in panic. We were all giddy by the time we made it back to the trail and felt like it was okay to slow down. Looking back, they probably just thought we had food and were waiting for us to leave, but it was more wild predators than I'm comfortable being around at once. 9 out of 10 scary in the moment, 5 out of 10 in hindsight.